There was a crow who was no sleeper, but a thief and a murderer, till a very late hour, and this keeper made him one of the things that were, to hang and flap in rain and wind, in the sun and in the snow. There are no more sins to be sinned on the dead oak tree bough. This is Carolina Haints. Welcome, dear listener, to the season finale of the Carolina Haints podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions and A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. Charleston, South Carolina, the holy city, the kingdom by the sea, is home to some of the most notorious tales of murder and macabre, of ghosts and pirates, of sin and punishment. And a woman named Lavinia Fisher embodies the very darkest vision of what Charleston has to offer. A lot isn't known about Lavinia Fisher, not because of any conspiracy, but because records prior to 1800 just weren't all that meticulous. We know that she was born in 1793, but no one knows where she was born or anything about her childhood. Even her maiden name is a mystery. But one thing we do know is that she's America's first female serial killer. Well, maybe. The records are so imprecise that there's some debate on whether or not she ever killed anyone at all. But nonetheless, she was hanged in Charleston in 1820. And on that day, standing on the gallows, with the rope hanging loosely around her neck, when asked if she had any last words, her answer might qualify as the best last words ever uttered, but we'll get back to that later. By all accounts, Lavinia was a beautiful woman. She married a man named John Fisher. Together they opened a small hotel called the 6 Mile Wayfarer House because, well, it was 6 miles outside of Charleston. Back in those days, a hotel usually served multiple functions. The 6 Mile Wayfarer House was a place you could rest during your travels, whether overnight or just for a couple of hours. It was a place where you could feed your horse, as well as yourself, and it was a place where you could find yourself a lot of trouble. From time to time, someone passing through Charleston would vanish without a trace. As more and more people disappeared, authorities noticed that what they all had in common was the 6 Mile Wayfarer House. They were all either staying there when they vanished or had just left. An investigation was started, but the Fishers were very well liked in the community, so the matter was ultimately dropped. In those days, most people made a living trading. It was also a time when many opted for the easy way out. These people saw a ship or a wagon load of trade goods as a nefarious opportunity. As pirates and privateers looted ships at sea, highwaymen ambushed traders on land, or they would trick them into rigged games of chance. As America ushered in the year of our Lord 1819, the citizens of Charleston decided they had enough. Traders were being ambushed and beaten, travelers were getting scammed and cheated, and people continued to go missing. By now, rumors persisted that the Fishers' 6 Mile Wayfarer House was the headquarters for criminal activity in the area. The consensus was that even if the Fishers weren't involved, they most certainly knew who was. In February of 1819, a vigilante lynch mob was formed to go pay the Fishers a little visit. It's difficult to know exactly how that confrontation went, but one source claims that the Fishers were told to vacate the premises, or it would be burned to the ground. Either way, the mob left satisfied that they had achieved their objective. They left behind a man named David Ross as overseer to keep watch on the area. However, the very next day, David Ross was attacked on the road and taken before a large group of highwaymen. He claimed that there were 2 or 3 women among them, including Fisher, who appeared to be their leader. He said that Lavinia personally
choked me and boxed my head through a pane of window glass,
while 2 other men beat him with loaded whips. However, according to his story, he managed to make it the 6 miles to Charleston relatively unscathed by an angry mob chasing him. Later that day, completely unaware of the melee that had occurred, a traveler named John Peoples stopped at the hotel to rest. Peoples gives us a first-hand account of the Fishers' modus operandi. John Fisher told Peoples that there were no rooms available, but that he was free to have a meal and rest a few hours. Lavinia showed him to the dining room and brought him a hot meal and some tea. She said that she was bored, so she sat and talked to him as he ate.
Tell me lies and entertain me.
People noticed John Fisher glancing over at them, but Lavinia was pleasant company, and as I said, she was a beautiful woman, so he didn't care very much what kind of looks they were getting. At some point in the conversation, Lavinia needed to step away to take care of some hotel business, and Peoples figured that their time was over. Peoples didn't like hot tea very much, but he didn't want to seem rude, so he drank a little while she had been there, and now that she had left, he took the opportunity to pour the rest of the tea into a nearby plant. But a short time later, she returned and sat with him a little while longer. She also informed him that the reason she had been called away was that a room had unexpectedly become available. Peoples booked the room and Lavinia walked him to it. She told them that it was her custom to bid guests goodnight with a cup of tea. Peoples winced but thanked her. He also admitted how glad he was that a room had opened up because he wasn't feeling very well. He felt nauseous and tired. She suggested that he drink the tea to settle his stomach and go straight to bed. He agreed, and they parted ways. Once inside, Peoples poured this cup of tea out as well. During the investigation, it would be discovered that Lavinia would dose certain guests' tea with oleander, a poisonous plant. Its potent effects include nausea, stomach aches, and in higher doses, it slows the heart enough to render a man unconscious. Since he had poured out most of his tea, his symptoms weren't that severe. He had no idea he had been poisoned. He just thought that he had had a bad stomach ache. He lay down on the bed, hoping it would pass. While he laid there, he started thinking. Lavinia had been asking a lot of questions. She had asked about his pocket watch. She had asked what he did for a living. He was concerned that he may have said enough to make himself a target for robbers. Who knows who may have overheard their conversation? Just in case, he got up and wedged a chair under the door handle. As soon as he had, he heard a loud crashing behind him. The entire bed was a trap door that dropped down into a bed of spikes. He crawled out of the window and fled back to Charleston. As David Ross was walking out of the sheriff's office, having filed a complaint against the Fishers, John Peoples was walking in. The sheriff gathered some men and arrested the Fishers, as well as 2 other men and a woman. They were taken to the old Charleston jail on historic Magazine Street. Built in 1802, the twin stonework towers were designed in the Romanesque Revival style. Creepy. They pled not guilty, but during the investigation, authorities searched the hotel and found various poisons, tons of weapons, hidden passages, trapdoors, and about 100 human remains. They were quickly found guilty of highway robbery by a jury. They immediately filed for appeal and were taken back to the old Charleston jail to await their next court date. But the Fishers had no intention of making their next court date. They began planning their escape. They tied their bedsheets together into a makeshift rope and planned to scale down the prison walls from their third-floor cell. And it almost worked. John climbed down and made it out, but the rope broke when John was just a few feet from the ground. He didn't hesitate. John wasn't going to leave Lavinia behind. He walked around to the front of the jail and turned himself back in. Due to their actions, the appeal was rejected. They were scheduled for execution by hanging on February 18th, 1820. A local preacher was sent to visit with them in the days before their execution. This was standard practice by the state to give those slated for execution a chance to confess and be forgiven and prepare their souls for the afterlife. John talked to the man at length, day after day, and they quietly prayed together. However, Lavinia rejected him, spitting in his face. On the day of the execution, several thousand people had gathered in the city square for the event. Lavinia had been granted her request to wear her wedding dress, and so they were taken before the gallows. The preacher had also accompanied them. John calmly walked up onto the gallows platform and asked the preacher to pray with him. Afterward, the preacher read a letter that he had helped John write. The letter vehemently declared their innocence and asked for prayers for the corrupt court officials who had set them up for this crime. As the slack of rope was drawn around his neck, he begged the crowd for forgiveness. Then the executioner pulled the lever and John fell, snapping his neck. Lavinia, however, was not as eager to accept her fate. She refused to walk up the stairs to the platform, and the guards were brought in to carry her, kicking and screaming. She was once more given the opportunity to have the preacher pray for her soul, but instead, as the noose was hung loosely around her neck, she cried her famous last words.
Cease! Save your words for others that want them. If any of you have a message for the devil, tell me now, or I shall be seeing him shortly.
The slack of noose was pulled tight against her neck. She saw the executioner's hand reach for the lever. She knew what was about to come next and decided she would leave this life the way she lived it, on her own terms, apologizing to no one. She ran forward and jumped off the front of the platform. Such a fall wouldn't break her neck, but left her gasping and struggling for breath, in full view of those in the front of the crowd. It took her a few minutes to pass. One witness said that,
"Oh, never have I seen such a wicked stare or chilling sneer. Oh, Lucifer himself was stoking the fires of that woman's sinister soul."
Lavinia Fisher was 27 years old at the time of her death. John was 29. Now, I mentioned at the start of this episode that there were inconsistencies in the official documents. So let's take a look at some of them. Many believe that the wedding dress is an embellishment for the ghost tours. Some reports showed that John Peoples was attacked on the road, beaten and robbed and threatened with death if he went to the authorities. Along those lines, they also claim that the hidden passages and trapdoors in the hotel are fictitious, and they say that the deaths occurred in much more mundane fashion, that John Fisher simply cut their throats. There is also some serious doubts that Lavinia Fisher jumped off of any platform. And there's even some debate about where they're buried. Some say they were interred at the Unitarian Church Cemetery on Archdale Street. Others claim the Circular Congregational Church Cemetery on Meeting Street. However, most of the inmates that were put to death ended up in a potter's field next to the jail. One interesting contradiction is the claim that the authorities found hundreds of human remains in the basement of the hotel. There are some documents that show only a handful of remains were found. Was this some sort of indication that John Fisher's accusation of corruption may have had some merit? And while you think about that, the source behind the debate about whether or not Lavinia can be considered America's first female serial killer comes from the fact that they were not convicted of murder. They were only convicted of highway robbery. Semantics, perhaps, but some would have this title given to Jane Toppin, a nurse who killed 31 of her patients and was arrested in 1901. So which stories are real and which are a hoax? That's up to you to decide, dear listener. Let's take a look at the old Charleston jail itself. The Fishers weren't the only notable criminals to spend time in the now infamous towers. Pirates and Civil War POWs have graced its halls. It was built in 1802 and served as a jail for the entire county for 137 years until it was closed in 1939. It's estimated that over 10,000 may have died on the property while it was in operation, and only a fraction of those were executions. The conditions, as you may expect, weren't very hygienic or humane. The jail was designed to hold 128 inmates, but there were times when as many as 350 people would be crammed into its cells. Many died due to illness. Many were killed by other inmates, and many were killed by overzealous guards. With so much death, it's easy to see how the old Charleston jail could be haunted. In fact, it's said to be one of the most active paranormal sites in the country. You've probably heard about it before. It seems like every TV ghost hunting show has investigated the place, as well as countless paranormal teams over the years. Reports there run the gamut of paranormal experiences. Things are said to move on their own. There's disembodied voices, doors slamming, cold spots, strange odors, batteries drained. The hum of the dumbwaiter can be heard even though it hasn't been operational in decades. People have taken photos that show the misty, vague faces of people who weren't really there. People report being pushed, or choked, or scratched. A tour guide had his sunglasses violently slapped away by some unseen force. It's thought to have many, many spirits. Pirates, prisoners of war, slaves, and who knows how many that simply thought they had been wrongfully convicted. But that's not all. The jail underwent renovations in 2000, and the construction workers reported finding human footprints in the dust on the floor. During this time, the building was always kept locked due to safety concerns during construction. They made an extensive search for any vagrant who might be hiding in the building. But what they found was more than they bargained for. A group of workers were confronted by a prison guard who rushed at them out of the shadows of a dark doorway. The man didn't make a sound, but his mouth was formed in the shape of a scream. He lowered the bayonet of his rifle toward them as he ran forward, but vanished just inches before reaching them. So what about the Fishers? Certainly Lavinia would make a great ghost story, right? Well, it's believed that she's the jail's most active spirit. She's said to haunt not only the jail, but the Unitarian Church Cemetery and the Pottersfield Cemetery. And who could blame her? Lavinia's life may have ended in the gallows pole, but the story continues, explaining why many believe that she also haunts a museum in Charleston. In 1922, 100 years after her execution, the Yorkville Inquirer published an article called Skeleton on Display. The expose reveals that Lavinia's skeletal remains have been put on display in the Charleston Museum. Despite the time that had passed, members of the public regularly spit on her bones and cursed them. Furthermore, the museum did not have legal permission to display the remains. Following the article, the museum removed the display, but only for a few weeks. Public complaints about the display's absence convinced the museum to reinstall them. The same Yorkville Inquirer ran a follow-up article accusing the museum of choosing profits over decency. Sightings at the old Charleston jail include people seeing an apparition in white walking the corridors of the building. She's also seen from the street, peering out of the windows. It's believed that the apparition in white is Lavinia herself in her wedding dress. To learn more about this story, check out Legends and Lore of South Carolina by Sherman Carmichael. There's charlestonterrors.com, nightlyspirits.com, ghostcitytours.com, and legendsofamerica.com. This episode was researched and written by Jeffrey Cochran. It was produced and narrated by me, Dan Sellers. You can find everything that we're up to at recapitproductions.com. Special thanks to Mike Burke and Gigi Galdo for contributing their vocal talents to this episode. You can find the Carolina Hates podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Or you can listen directly from the feed at carolinahates.libsyn.com. It would mean a lot if you would leave us a 5-star review and share the show with your friends. You can pick up your copy of the Carolina Hates book at Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Amazon, or pretty much any book retailer. Again, a positive review on Amazon will be greatly appreciated. Before we end the season, I'd like to take a moment to invite you to come out and join us at an upcoming appearance. Jeff and I will be making the rounds across North Carolina to give Carolina Hates speaking engagements. This spring and summer we'll be in Asheville, Marshall, and Southern Pines. And this fall we'll be in Shelby, Kings Mountain, and Raleigh. For exact dates and times, check out carolinahates.com/appearances. Also, we'd love for you to join us in Jamestown, North Carolina this May for the dedication ceremony of our very first Legends and Lore historical marker. We'll be meeting at Lydia's Haunted Bridge off East Main Street, where we'll reveal the marker itself and hear from some special guests. This is a big deal for Carolina Hates as we plan to help place these markers all across the Carolinas in years to come. So please, come join us. And if you'd like to be a part of Carolina Hates and all our ongoing efforts, then I'd like to encourage you to join our Patreon campaign. For your level of contribution, you're eligible to get some killer perks, including monthly behind-the-scenes looks, monthly mini episodes, and our very own map of monsters and legends, exclusively for members only. You can find it all at patreon.com/Carolina Hates. A big thanks to Richard Church and Dan Anderson for their ongoing contributions. We couldn't do it without you guys. You can find all things Carolina Hates, from this podcast to the book to multiple videos, on our official website, carolinahates.com. While you're at it, make sure to like and follow our Facebook page at facebook.com/Carolina Hates. And as always, You can send me your questions or comments to carolinahates@gmail.com. This episode marks the end of the 6th season of the Carolina Hates podcast. Jeff and I are going to be taking a little break, but don't worry. We're already hard at work to bring you new and spooky content. We'll be back with the premiere of Season 7 of the Carolina Hates podcast on Friday, September 22nd, 2023. Tune in then to hear more about the things that go bump in the night.